Altona man accused of murdering his wife and two stepchildren made another appearance in court today after being formally indicted by a grand jury in their murders. And the victims' loved ones packed.
Every morning, before the sun rises over Florida, a grieving mother whispers the same prayer. God, let today be the day I find my family. For years, those words have echoed in silence. Because her daughter, Yessenia Suarez, and two beloved grandchildren vanished without a trace, and the man believed to know the truth has never revealed where they are. Before this case became a nightmare, Yessenia was simply a young mother trying to build a better life. She was 28 years old, hardworking, loving, devoted to her children. Friends and family say nothing mattered more to her than being a mother. Her daughter, Thalia, known as Tia, was bright and full of joy. Her son, Michael Elijah, was playful, sweet, and deeply attached to his family. They were children with futures ahead of them, birthdays still to celebrate, schools still to finish, dreams still waiting. And at the center of their world was Yessenia, the woman doing everything she could to keep life together. But life had not always been easy. Like many young mothers, Yessenia wanted stability. She wanted love. She wanted a man who could help protect the family she cherished. That was when Luis Toledo entered her life. At first, he seemed like the answer. Strong, confident, protective. Someone who looked like he could shoulder burdens she had carried alone for too long. The two met years earlier, and the relationship moved quickly. To Yessenia, Luis may have seemed like a second chance at happiness. But appearances can be dangerously misleading. Luis carried a violent reputation. People knew him as someone with a temper and a past tied to crime and gang life. Still, Yessenia believed people could change. Many good-hearted people do. They see the wounded version of someone and hope love can heal what violence created. Soon they married. From the outside, it may have looked like a family finally coming together. A mother in love, a man trying to start over, children gaining a father figure. But behind closed doors, the reality was already beginning to crack. Yessenia worked hard to provide. She held steady employment and kept the household moving. Luis, meanwhile, struggled to become the dependable partner she needed. He talked about plans. He talked about change. But words do not carry families. Actions do. As time passed, Yessenia found herself doing what many women in troubled marriages know too well, carrying everything alone while pretending she wasn't tired. Bills, children, work, stress, responsibility. And every day, the gap between who Luis promised to be and who he truly was grew wider. Still, Yessenia kept trying, because mothers often stay strong long after they are exhausted, because children need routine, because hope can survive longer than it should. But something darker was slowly growing inside that house. Resentment, failure, and a jealousy that would soon become deadly. The family did not know it yet, but the man they trusted was beginning to lose control. And when people like that feel they are losing everything, they sometimes choose to destroy it. Coming in ACT 2, the marriage begins to collapse as accusations, rage, and suspicion turn their home into a ticking time bomb. If you love real crime stories told with depth and suspense, subscribe now to Criminal Instincts with Sday and stay with us for the next act. At first, it didn't look like danger. It looked like arguments, like tension, like a couple going through normal problems. But what was happening inside Yessenia Suarez's marriage was far from normal, because jealousy had begun to take root in Luis Toledo. And once it settled in, it started to change everything. It didn't arrive loudly. It arrived slowly, in questions that sounded harmless at first, in comments that seemed like concern, in suspicion that grew without proof. Who are you texting? Where were you? Why didn't you answer? Who was that man? Why are you working so late? At first, Yessenia may have tried to explain everything, to calm him, to reassure him, to keep peace in a house that was already starting to feel heavy. But jealousy doesn't survive on answers. It survives on doubt, and doubt always wants more. Luis was no longer just a husband trying to understand his partner. He was becoming someone who needed control to feel secure. And control is where relationships begin to turn dangerous. Yessenia worked hard, often outside the home, interacting with coworkers and managing responsibilities. But instead of trust, Luis began to see threats everywhere. Normal conversations became suspicious. Normal interactions became accusations. Even silence became something to question. In his mind, something was happening, whether it was real or not didn't seem to matter anymore. Because jealousy doesn't always need truth. It builds its own version of reality. And once that version takes over, everything starts to look like betrayal. At the same time, financial pressure was also weighing heavily on the household. Yessenia was the one keeping things stable. She worked, she provided, she carried responsibility. Luis, however, was not contributing in the same way. That imbalance created tension inside the home. Resentment grew quietly in the background. And resentment is dangerous because it does not stay still. It waits. It builds. It remembers. On the surface, life continued. The children still laughed, still went to school, still lived in a home that, to outsiders, might not have seemed broken. But children notice things adults try to hide. They feel tone changes. They hear arguments through walls. They sense when warmth disappears. Thalia and Michael were growing up in a home where love and tension existed side by side. And that kind of environment leaves marks even when no one talks about it. As time passed, Luis became more emotionally unstable. His mood shifted, his temper shortened, his suspicion deepened. And the more Yessenia tried to maintain balance, the more pressure seemed to build. It was no longer a partnership. It was becoming a cycle. Conflict, silence, tension, repeat. Then came the accusations that changed everything. Luis began believing Yessenia was involved with another man. A co-worker named Kevin Dredden became the center of his suspicions. Whether those suspicions were real or imagined, they consumed him. Jealousy turned into obsession. Obsession turned into anger. And anger turned into confrontation. Text messages between them became increasingly hostile. Yessenia tried to defend herself, tried to explain, tried to calm things down. But Luis was no longer listening to reassurance. He was looking for confirmation of what he already believed. And when someone reaches that stage, the truth stops mattering. Only their belief remains. Tension escalated to the point where even normal communication felt like conflict. Every message carried weight. Every delay became suspicion. Every explanation was questioned again and again. And slowly, the relationship stopped feeling like love at all. It started feeling like pressure, like control, like something was tightening around both of them. And Yessenia began to realize something painful. She was no longer in a relationship built on trust. She was in a relationship built on doubt. And doubt does not build a future. It destroys it. Eventually, the breaking point arrived. Yessenia could no longer continue in the same cycle. The jealousy, the arguments, the instability, the emotional exhaustion. Something inside her made a decision many people fear but eventually reach. She wanted out. She wanted a divorce. To her, it may have sounded like a way forward, a chance to breathe, a chance to rebuild, a chance to give her children peace. But to someone like Luis, that word can feel like loss of control. And loss of control can trigger something unpredictable. Still, at that moment, it was just a decision. A painful, difficult, but necessary decision. Yessenia believed separation might finally bring calm. She believed distance might reduce conflict. She believed things could be handled peacefully. That belief would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined. Because when a relationship built on control begins to break, what follows is never calm. It is escalation. And the stage was now set for the final days before everything disappeared. Coming in ACT 3, a confrontation, a workplace incident, and the final moments before Yessenia and her children are last seen alive. If you're following this story, subscribe to Criminal Instincts with Sday for the next chapter, where everything changes forever. By the time the relationship reached its breaking point, nothing inside the home felt stable anymore. What once looked like a family was now held together by tension, suspicion, and silence. And silence, in cases like this, is never peaceful. Is the calm before something breaks. Yessenia Suarez had made a decision that would change everything. She wanted a divorce, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a final step toward reclaiming her life. To her, it may have felt like survival, a way to escape the constant arguments, the jealousy, the emotional pressure that had slowly taken over her marriage. But to Luis Toledo, it was something else entirely. It was rejection. It was loss. It was the collapse of control. And that is when things began to move faster. In relationships already under strain, separation doesn't always bring distance immediately. Sometimes it brings escalation first. The arguments intensified. The accusations became sharper. Trust completely disappeared. Even simple communication turned into conflict. Every message felt loaded. Every interaction felt like evidence in a case neither of them could escape. Then came a moment that escalated everything. A workplace confrontation. Luis showed up at Yessenia's job, angry and emotionally overwhelmed. What began as a personal argument was now spilling into public space. Witnesses later described a scene filled with tension. A husband confronting his wife in a place where professionalism should have existed, but emotion took over instead. Voices were raised. Accusations were exchanged. The situation became unstable quickly. At one point, Luis believed he had discovered proof of betrayal. Messages or conversations involving the co-worker he suspected, Kevin Dredden. Whether the interpretation was accurate or distorted by jealousy, it no longer mattered in his mind. Because once belief replaces evidence, actions follow emotion, not truth. The confrontation escalated further. Police were reportedly called to the scene after the situation became disruptive and concerning. By the time authorities were involved, the damage was already done. The marriage was no longer private. It was now visible, exposed, fragile, and unraveling in real time. After the incident, Yessenia made another choice. She would not stay in the same environment that had become unstable and emotionally unsafe. She returned to her mother's home later that day. It was supposed to be a pause, a moment to think, a chance to breathe away from the tension. Her mother, Felicita Perez, saw what many parents see in moments like this: a daughter exhausted, overwhelmed, and trying to hold her life together. There was concern, there was fear, and there was a quiet understanding that something serious was happening inside that marriage. That evening, family members spoke. Warnings were given. Advice was offered. And like many parents who sense danger but cannot fully control it, Felicita expressed what any mother would say in that moment. Be careful. Stay safe. Don't go back into something that feels unstable. But Yessenia was torn between fear and responsibility, between her children, between her home, between the life she had built and the life she was trying to escape. Eventually, she made a decision that would later haunt everyone who knew her. She would return home, not because everything was fixed, not because everything was safe, but because she still believed things could be managed. That night, she left her mother's house and walked back into the place where everything had been breaking. It was the last confirmed time her family saw her alive. What happened inside that house after she returned has been pieced together only through later investigation, statements, and evidence. But at that moment, no one knew it was the final chapter. Not Yessenia, not her children, not her mother. The next morning, something felt wrong immediately. Felicita, like every other day, expected a call, a routine check-in, a mother-daughter habit that had never been broken. But that morning, the phone stayed silent. No message, no call, no response. At first, she may have thought it was just a delay, but as time passed, anxiety began to grow. Calls were made, voicemails left, still nothing. And that silence, the absence of something so routine, is often the first warning sign that something is seriously wrong. Felicita went to Yessenia's home, and what she found outside would begin the nightmare. There was confusion, then concern, then fear, and eventually, police were called. When officers arrived and began examining the situation, the tone changed immediately, because inside the home, something did not feel normal. There were signs that raised questions. A strange chemical smell in the air. cleaners used in a way that seemed excessive, and small details that suggested an attempt to erase what had happened. At the same time, there was no sign of Yessenia, no sign of Tia, no sign of Michael. A mother and 2 children gone. When Luis Toledo was questioned, his responses did not provide clarity. Instead, they created more confusion. He claimed they had left, that they were gone, that he didn't know where they were. But the family knew Yessenia would never disappear without telling her mother, and she would never leave her children behind. Something was terribly wrong. Very quickly, the case shifted from a missing persons report to something far darker. Inside the home, investigators began searching for evidence. What they would later find would change the entire direction of the investigation. But at this moment, the truth was still buried, and 3 people were still missing. A mother, a daughter, a son, all last seen inside a home that now felt like it was hiding something no one wanted to face. Coming in ACT 4, the investigation inside the house begins, and what police uncover will turn this missing persons case into a murder investigation. If you're following this true crime story, subscribe to Criminal Instincts with Sday so you don't miss the next act. When police first stepped inside the home, nothing about it felt normal. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary family house. Furniture in place, rooms intact, everyday life frozen in time. But the moment investigators began to focus, something else became clear. This was not just a missing persons case anymore. It was a scene filled with unanswered questions, and the most disturbing answers were still hidden beneath what someone had tried to clean. One of the first things officers noticed was the smell. A strong chemical odor lingered inside the house. The kind of smell that doesn't belong in a home where nothing is wrong. It was sharp, overpowering, and intentional. Cleaning products had been used heavily in certain areas, almost as if someone had tried to remove evidence rather than simply clean a home. That detail immediately raised suspicion, because in missing persons cases, normal people don't clean like that. Not when their partner and 2 children are gone. Not when there is confusion. Not when there is panic. That kind of cleaning often points in a different direction. Control, cover up, delay. As investigators moved through the rooms, they began documenting everything. Every surface, every corner, every detail that could later matter. Then came something even more troubling. Small traces that did not belong. In different areas of the home, there were faint signs that suggested something violent may have occurred. Not obvious at first, not immediately visible, but present enough to change the direction of the case. Tiny spots, unusual marks, areas that seemed out of place in a home that was supposedly normal just hours before. These details alone were not enough to explain what happened, but they were enough to deepen suspicion. At the same time, there was still no sign of Yessenia Suarez. No sign of her children, Tia and Michael. A mother and 2 children had vanished inside a home that now felt more like a sealed room of unanswered questions. When Luis Toledo was questioned again, his responses did not match the growing concerns. He insisted they had left, that he didn't know where they went, that maybe Yessenia had chosen to disappear. But those close to her immediately rejected that idea. Yessenia was a devoted mother. She would not leave her children behind, not willingly, not without telling her own mother. That was something everyone agreed on. So investigators began focusing not on whether something had happened, but on what had happened inside the home, and who had been there when it did. Luis became a central focus of the investigation. His movements, his behavior, his explanations, and more importantly, his inconsistencies. Because in cases like this, truth often reveals itself not in what people say, but in what they change. As detectives continued their work, more evidence began to surface outside the home as well. Witness accounts, timeline gaps, and details that suggested Luis had been moving between locations in a way that didn't align with his statements. Every new piece of information made his version of events weaker, and the suspicion stronger. Then came a critical development. Investigators began discovering items connected to the household in unusual places. Some discarded, some hidden, some located far from where they should have been. Among those discoveries were personal belongings linked to Yessenia and the children. things that should never have been separated from them if they had simply left on their own. These findings shifted everything, because missing persons cases rely on voluntary disappearance as a possibility. But when personal items appear discarded or hidden, that possibility weakens dramatically. At this stage, the case was no longer just about where they went. It was about what had happened to them. Inside interrogation rooms, Luis continued to deny involvement in anything serious. He insisted he was confused. He insisted he had nothing to do with their disappearance. But investigators were no longer only listening to his words. They were comparing them to the physical evidence, and the gap between the two was growing wider. Then came another disturbing realization. The pattern of cleaning inside the home suggested urgency. Not routine cleaning, not household maintenance, but something more desperate, something meant to erase traces of a moment that had already passed. Investigators know that in many violent cases, attempts to clean or cover up often happen after the fact, when someone realizes what has occurred and tries to delay discovery. That possibility now became part of the investigation. Meanwhile, the family was living in emotional chaos. Felicita Perez, Yessenia's mother, was refusing to accept silence as an answer. She knew her daughter, she knew her grandchildren, and she knew they would not simply vanish without a trace. Her fear was turning into certainty. Something had happened inside that home, and she needed answers no matter how painful they might be. As days passed, pressure increased on law enforcement. Where were they? What happened inside the house? Why were there signs of cleanup? Why were personal belongings found in strange locations? And why did Luis Toledo's story keep changing? Each question led to another. Each inconsistency added weight. Each discovery narrowed the possibilities. And slowly, the case began transforming from uncertainty into something far more serious. A homicide investigation was beginning to form, but investigators still needed one final piece, something definitive enough to confirm what they already suspected. Because suspicion alone is not enough in court. Evidence must speak, and soon it would. What was hidden inside the home would eventually connect the dots between disappearance and violence, between denial and truth, between silence and what really happened to Yessenia Suarez and her children. But at this moment, the truth was still just out of reach. And the man at the center of it all still refused to tell the full story. Coming in ACT 5, the confession, the courtroom, and the shocking truth behind what really happened, and why the bodies were never found. If you're following this case, subscribe to At Criminal Instincts with Sday, and stay tuned for the final act where everything is revealed. By the time investigators reached the final stage of the case, the atmosphere had changed completely. This was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was no longer about confusion or uncertainty. It had become something far heavier. A murder investigation built on silence, evidence, and a story that kept collapsing under its own contradictions. At the center of it all was Luis Toledo, a husband who insisted he had no answers, a man who claimed his family had simply disappeared. But the evidence told a different story. Piece by piece, investigators had built a timeline that did not support his version of events, and pressure was closing in from every direction. Inside the interrogation room, the tone shifted. What began as questioning became confrontation. Detectives presented inconsistencies. They showed him information that did not match his statements. They challenged his explanations, and they waited. Because in cases like this, truth often comes not from sudden confession, but from pressure that finally becomes unbearable. For hours, Luis continued to deny responsibility. He repeated the same claims. He insisted he didn't know where Yessenia or the children were. He suggested they may have left on their own. But investigators were no longer working with maybes. They were working with physical evidence, timeline breakdowns, and contradictions that could not be ignored. Then something changed. Over time, cracks began to appear in his story. Small at first, then wider. Emotional pressure inside the room increased. The weight of the situation began to settle in. And eventually, the version of events he had been holding onto began to break. What followed was not a clean explanation. It was fragmented, conflicted and disturbing. Luis eventually admitted that something violent had happened inside the home. He described an argument, a confrontation that escalated. He claimed emotions took over. And in that moment, Yessenia Suarez lost her life. According to his statement, it was not planned, not premeditated, but a moment of rage that spiraled beyond control. A moment that changed everything forever. But the story did not end there, because the most horrifying part was still missing. The children, Thalia and Michael. When questioned further, Luis gave a second version of events that investigators would later challenge heavily. He attempted to shift responsibility away from himself, suggesting that another person may have been involved in what happened afterward. A neighbor, a third party, someone else who allegedly entered the situation. But investigators found no credible evidence supporting that claim. No physical proof, no consistent timeline, no independent confirmation. Instead, what they saw was something far more common in cases like this. A shifting narrative, an attempt to divide responsibility, a way to reduce personal accountability. And as pressure increased, one fact became undeniable. The children were never located. No recovery. No trace that could fully explain what happened to them. Only evidence suggesting they had been inside the home at the time everything unfolded. This was no longer a mystery of disappearance. It was a case defined by loss, and absence, and silence. Eventually, Luis Toledo was charged with the murders of Yessenia Suarez and her two children, Thalia and Michael. The case moved toward trial, and in court, prosecutors laid out a narrative built on evidence, behavior, and inconsistencies. They described jealousy, control, escalation, and a final act of violence that destroyed an entire family. The defense argued emotional breakdown, a moment of rage, and attempted to shift parts of the blame elsewhere. But the evidence presented was overwhelming. Blood evidence, cleaning attempts, contradictory statements, and the inability of the defendant to provide any credible explanation for the disappearance of 3 people. The jury ultimately reached a verdict. Guilty, on all counts. The courtroom fell into silence as the decision was read. Justice, in legal terms, had been delivered. Luis Toledo was sentenced to life in prison. No parole, no release. 3 lives taken, 3 sentences given, 1 man responsible. But even after the verdict, the case did not feel complete, because one critical question remained unanswered. Where are Yessenia Suarez and her children? That question became the most haunting part of the entire story, because despite conviction, despite evidence, despite testimony, there was still no closure, no recovery, no final resting place, only silence. For Felicita Perez, the pain did not end with the trial. In many ways, it continued. Because justice in court does not always equal peace in heart. She still wakes up each morning with the same prayer, hoping for answers, hoping for closure, hoping for something that has never come. And in that silence, one truth remains unshakable. A mother, her daughter, and 2 innocent children vanished inside a home and were never brought back. Only the man responsible knows the full truth, and he has chosen not to tell it. As the case fades into memory for some, it remains a wound that never fully heals for those left behind. Because some stories end with justice, but not with peace. And this is one of them. If you followed this story from the beginning, subscribe now to Criminal Instincts with Sday for more real-life crime stories told with cinematic detail, emotional depth, and truth that doesn't fade with time.